three wonderful presentations on, I'd say, different offsites, as Marina calls them, of green technologies, of different green technologies taking place in particular sites. In a way, these were all they circulated a bit around this issue of industries, or the realities, materialities of industry and their imaginaries, and ethics of work, hope, and the future of particular places and people. So these were issues including precarity and others that make the realities of life in these places. In the end, Simone, she kind of summed it up that it was all about life and death. So we were talking, were big concepts being raised in the room. So we're curious how this turns out in the next session, in the 4 presentations that we'll have now. So I'll hand over to Cristóbal, who will chair, who will lead us through this second session. Thank you so much.
Perfect. So welcome back again. And now it's the turn of Pauline Destre. So I welcome Pauline to the panel, and I will introduce you, but if you want to just join there. Pauline Destre is a research fellow in anthropology at the University of St. Andrews and the Center for Energy Ethics. Since 2014, she has been researching energy politics and practices in Ghana, looking at electricity outage, the history of hydropower, renewable, and the new oil industry. She's currently working on a book manuscript on energy transition and environmental futures in Ghana. So thanks, Pauline, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the panel so far, and what I'm going to present today is actually something quite different to a lot of the work that I've been doing on energy, because I'm going to be looking at hazardous waste around the kind of oil fields in Ghana. But I think that actually speaks really well to the other papers that we've had in the previous session. So 15 years ago, Ghana was at the, do I press here?
You just click on the presentation and now you can carry on.
Sorry, on this one, hey?
Yeah,
there you go. Oops. So 15 years ago, Ghana was at the heart of an oil and gas exploration boom in sub-Saharan Africa. This was before the kind of fracking boom in the US, when West Africa, the whole kind of Gulf of Guinea appeared as a really good prospect for exploration. And it discovered oil offshore in 2007, starting a kind of new era of, or hopes for a new era of oil abundance in the region. Takoradi, the capital of the Western region in Ghana, then became the seat of this new oil and gas industry. It had, since colonial times, served as the country's main export town, connecting the gold mines and other extractive industries in the region with the sea. So with the arrival of oil, there were grand plans to make the Western region into an oil and gas logistics hub for West Africa, with the ports undergoing expansion and with the creation of a new free trade zone. This is some of the, this is the port undergoing expansion. But this also obviously created a lot of fears amongst local communities of the impact of new oil on fishing and their livelihoods. But what I'm going to look at today is this company that I will call GEM, that's situated in the industrial enclave on the outskirts of the city. And this company tried to kind of find a new opportunity in this recent discovery of oil. It was founded as the first Ghanaian company to introduce what they call environmental technologies to hazardous waste management. And it's the main facility in the region for the oil fields. So it caters for not just the oil fields, but the mines, maritime operations, and manufacturing. And at GEM, chemical and environmental engineers have been trying to introduce what they call a proper and a formalized system of waste management and of waste monitoring as well in Ghana's expanding industrial and extractive sectors. So some of the things that they've done is they have built this Petroleum Lab, which they hope to work in partnership with the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana on oil spill prevention and remediation. They also treat all of the waste from maritime shipping at the port. That's actually how they started the operation when Ghana ratified the MARPOL Convention, the MARPOL Treaty on Maritime Pollution. So this is a shipping vessel to the rig, and they kind of take all of the waste from the ports. That includes most of the vessels used for global shipping. They also do bioremediation on contaminated mud, and they're working with the Atomic Energy Commission on a burial site for radioactive waste from the oil fields. This is where they treat most of the kind of chemical and wastewater waste. And they recently entered into a partnership with the German International Climate Initiative to build this incinerator that will be fitted with an emissions monitor to process waste that contains ozone depleting substances or refrigerant gases that you usually find in things like fridges and air conditioners. So at GEM, hazardous waste tells a little bit of a different story about decarbonization. David, an environmental engineer, expects that alongside the e-waste, the oily rags, and all of the chemicals that they currently treat, they will soon be treating solar panels and lithium batteries as well. Energy transitions are happening elsewhere, he tells me, in Europe and North America, but the waste from the extractive sector will always need to be treated in places like GEM. So I think, as we've discussed in the previous presentations as well, waste has emerged as a contentious object that puts into question the renewability of our energy systems and our energy futures. For David, remediating waste addresses a much bigger problem, one that really transcends this narrow focus on a particular fuel or a particular technology. No matter what energy source you choose to use, David tells me, controlling the waste is what becomes the issue. Here, for instance, we make sure that the waste generated from the oil fields does not harm the environment. Our new incinerator will treat gas that would have otherwise ended up in the atmosphere. At the end of the day, it comes down to making sure you put in mechanisms to correct it. At least that is helping. Sorry. And so in this paper, I want to think a little bit more about decarbonization from the standpoint of waste and its remediation. So like many of the engineers, technicians, and workers at GEM, David foregrounds what the industry calls remediation work as a vital, if partial, attempt to mitigate the environmental impact of extractive industrialism. But rather than discarding remediation work as a very technocratic and a purely technocratic solution, I want to reconsider what remediation entails for places like GEM that are situated at marginal endpoints of mineral extraction and energy production, but places that really seek to generate new knowledge and practices about remediating extractive environments. And that entails trying to make compatible very conflicting environmental and economic projects. And so the kind of question that I'm trying to address here is, how do they think about remediation as more than a technical process? And I'll give a few examples, which have to be quite limited, but a few examples of how what they see remediation as is actually really working across political arrangements and regulatory arrangements, and really trying to create new environmental and political configurations in the country and I suppose globally as well. So in environmental science and industrial waste management, remediation refers to the removal or the reduction of contaminants in soil and water. But the chemical complexity of hazardous waste often makes the work of remediation very difficult, if not technically impossible. So for instance, the chemical waste that they treat at the sites that comes from drilling fluids and drilling muds, so things that are used in oil production, are often trade secrets that makes their composition unknowable. So most of the waste that they treat that comes from chemicals is unknown. And while their lab is equipped to know whether they fit with the parameters of acceptable discharge, it doesn't actually tell them what they're dealing with. And David suspects that companies exploit this to drop expired chemicals into the oily wastewater, or else that they give them for discharge in order to cut down costs. He suspects that's why the waste that he treats on a daily basis is regularly above all of the EPA requirements for conductivity, for instance. And so he has to try and manage and try to manage that waste through deductions and experimentation. I don't have time to explain how he does that, but in the longer version of the paper, I do. Another limitation is that most hazardous waste is subject to those kind of permissible limits that are set by national or international authorities, but many industries, including the oil industry, are exempt from many of those. And so, of course, some of the waste, like radioactive waste, is impossible to remediate and implies thinking about very different kinds of questions about storage and risk on time span that far outlasts future generations. So the kind of theoretical framing of these field sites, scholars of waste and toxicity, mostly in the context of the history of remediation in the US, have become very skeptical of the very possibility of remediation. And they have asked, what comes after remediation if no form of remediation will ever be enough to reverse the effects of pollution. They have asked, how do we live in a permanently polluted world? But as David and his colleagues have made clear to me, remediation work involves much more than the technical solving of chemical issues. It takes place across political relations, timescapes, corporate interests, and chemical bonds. And it tries to create visions and hopes for a new rearrangement of environmental and political relations. But there's another kind of theoretical aspect to this, which is that much of the scholarship on hazardous waste in West Africa in particular has really focused on informal work and the dangerous exposure of waste workers at informal recycling sites. Something like, the site of Abu Bloshi in Accra is really paradigmatic of this kind of scholarship, and has become somewhat of a typical example of what Steve Lerner has called sacrifice zones, and we talked a little bit about that in the first presentation. And rightly so. I mean, there's very little data on hazardous waste, but it's estimated by the EPA in Ghana that in the case of e-waste, for instance, only about 1% is formally recycled. So GEM is part of this kind of 1% of what happened in a formal context. And so in contrast, workers at GEM are really trying to create those formal systems of monitoring and remediation precisely to address these conditions of unequal exposure. Their work and perspectives are important, I want to argue, because we often fail to examine what hope and visions for better remediation might look like. And this is really what they're trying to bring about. What happens when and where capacity is built, and what might capacity even mean in a context of irremediable waste that can never be remediated. So in this paper, what I hope to do in its longer form is to try and not just draw attention to sacrifice zones, but also to try and theorize what remediation zones might be, as sites where practices of repair reimagine what it means to live through and to be tasked with the care of polluted environments. Over the past 2 years, I've spent some time following the waste from the oil fields and the port to the landfill and to the site at GEM. And based on fieldwork at this site, I describe attempts by mostly engineers, Ghanaian engineers and chemists, to create environmental control in the face of what they see as a surging extractivism, and how they try from this waste site to generate better science and environmental futures.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Oh gosh, okay. The manager of the site would often, explain this kind of desire for formal management by comparing it to the informal work. So he would say, we want to do everything professionally. Others want to do it booga booga, like the kind of informal, illegal way, the Kokompe way. But here at GEM, we want to do it the right way. Most companies don't care. They get into waste management, they get a permit, but they don't actually have capacity. So one of the questions that I'm trying to look at here is how does capacity get discredited in this context? So one of examples of this is, he took me to show me this, they're investing in all of these new machines that are supposedly better at remediating the waste, at remediating hazardous waste, in order to give no excuse to companies to dispose of their waste properly, to have no excuse to do illegal dumping. So this is something that he called the robots, and he described to me, he was really proud of this machine, saying that this is the only one in all of West Africa, and yet since they bought it, they've never been able to use it, partly for political reasons, which I don't have time to get into, but partly because companies just prefer to pay cheap labor to do manual entry into those containers. And the manager of the site, Mr. Jackson, was explaining that there is, toxicity is obviously very difficult to see and to conceptualize, and that was something that they were trying to push against, and to really create better protective controls for this. So when I saw the machine, he showed it to me, and the computer still had the kind of protective plastic layer. It was just there gathering dust. And I started thinking about, what does it mean to have capacity in a context where capacity is devalued or often racialized? Because one of the struggles that they've had in trying to attract contracts for their work is that most companies don't believe, they say Ghanaians can do it, because this is a Ghanaian company that hasn't worked with foreign companies before. It becomes very difficult for them to essentially prove their expertise. Had another example about radioactive waste, but I think I'm going to leave that if I don't have the time. But essentially, it's a very similar story where they've found radioactive waste from the oil fields, and really invested a lot of time in training in learning how to deal with this, and really try to devise a site. They wanted to do geological surveys to find a proper site in Ghana. They actually wanted to send the waste to the US to a company that they had done training with. But the oil company in Ghana and the regulators weren't really interested in thinking about the future in the way that they were trying to do. So they found out that actually out of the 200 or so drums that were supposed to arrive, only 17 arrived at their site. They think because they were all downgraded to low levels radioactive waste, which can just be treated like any other normal hazardous waste. And so they were, really trying to make regulators and companies change their mind about how they viewed what it meant to have to care for this waste in generations and generations to come. I think I'll conclude here. Yeah. Yeah. So in this work, I'm really trying to think about remediation from the standpoint of engineers, but beyond this kind of idea that remediation is impossible if all it entails is this kind of technical solving of a chemical issue, and trying to find what good remediation might mean for people who are trying to forge new visions of hope and dedication about this. So a nice quote to end it on was that they told me engineering is biblical. It isn't just technical. It's about helping people and politics to get better. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudine, very much. I think we need to move immediately to the next paper, and if we have clarification questions, maybe we can go back to them at the end. Because in this panel, in this session, we have 4 presentations, so we will be able. Sorry?
I didn't know how.
Is it possible? Okay, in the meantime, I will present Daniela Soto. Daniela Soto Hernandez is a social anthropologist and master's in sociology with 12 years of experience working in research and consultancy in Chile. Currently, she is in the third year of a PhD in international development at the University of Sussex, researching lithium extraction in the Atacama Research Institute. Her research interests include political ecology, extractivism, decoloniality, and gender. So, welcome, Daniela. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the organizers and everyone to be here, for being here. So by the time I decided to research lithium extraction, lithium was already a matter of concern, to quote Latour, in the global and national spheres. Sustainable and profitable futures were associated with the hegemonic technomanagerial approach to address the global environmental crisis, where lithium was seen as a key component. And due to its lightness, as well as its storage and driving capacity, lithium was repeatedly framed as a central materiality in lithium-ion batteries. For example, Forbes published an article in 2008 pointing out that this greasy solution, referring to brines, yields the substance that makes modern life possible, lithium. The lightest of all metals, lithium is the key ingredient in the rechargeable batteries that keep cell phones and laptops humming. Chile is the Saudi Arabia of lithium. This narrative was tied to Chile since the US Geological Survey had estimated that the biggest lithium reserve lied under the ground of an area called Lithium Triangle, a commodity supply zone, to quote Bridge, that designates 3 salt flats in the northern Chile and Argentina and southern Bolivia. This narrative of prosperity and growth arrived in Chile from the global north as another promise of future development with capital D, and as an unmissable opportunity for the world's energy transition. The idea was highly echoed in the national politics, where senators and even the president saw an opportunity to revive extractive development imaginaries. Indeed, in 2015, President Bachelet said in her speech, lithium is such an important future mineral that some have even called it the white oil of the 21st century, a resource that puts Chile in a privileged position in front of the world, which we cannot afford to waste or misspend. However, as Bridge has developed, resources and commodity supply zones are always a social construct, and several issues interplay in this process. Technology and socioeconomical variables made lithium something, where others saw a sacred entity like the Atacama salt flat with its flamencos or even salt. By putting in place the very idea of lithium existence and future development imaginaries, also quote, we're deepening the already installed narrative of Chile as a mining country. And this quote also reveals how Aspalama is another, it was another mining, a very contested one. And even before it entered doing things, it was already destroying the environment. Lithium then was supposed to bring equitable and sustainable development and a more than primary export economy that copper and projects, other projects like this one, have not. Indeed, 12 months, a 12-month ethnography in Chile, for me, was a struggle to find lithium, which was not at any point visible or differentiable as a materiality. During the first months, I struggled to bring lithium into my quotidian conversations in San Pedro Atacama. For example, Diego, a shepherd that I met while he was taking care of his sheep, looked at me with surprise when I asked him if it was better to work in the lithium mining or in the copper ones, and particularly Minera Escondida, the biggest. And he seemed a bit annoyed by the question, and he said, why would somebody want to work in the Salar lithium when they can work in Escondida, copper? They have the best salary and the better benefits. And just like the surprise in his face, I saw other surprises in mining workers' face when I asked them about energy transition, looking at me like, what is that? Diego and they, and these lithium mining workers were far more interested on what's getting in place rather than what's getting out of the place. Therefore, I started to wonder what was the fuss about lithium really about? And I started thinking about how lithium became a matter of concern and extractable matter in the first place. So I want to draw your attention to what needs to be in place and installed in order to extract, because it allows us to deepen our understanding of the current social environmental crisis and implies our historization of what comes in to be extracted. Equally, I argue that putting attention to what is extracted plays a crucial role to deconstruct the ways in which extraction produce hegemonic worlds and territories and to build decolonial green hopes. For example, roads that have been created to explore and monitor the salt flat and have already destroyed the salt flat, just like the glaciers in the other case of the quote. As such, I think insertion allows us to understand the depth and the strength of all the issues that need to be in place for extraction to occur in an ongoing process of insertion and extraction, as I hope to show in the case of lithium and energy transition. So following history and geology, millions of years were needed to form all the layers that lied underground, invisible, constituted the Salar de Atacama, that just like lithium were not visible to the human eye in the watershed, although they constituted. In fact, as part of underground salty waters, brines, lithium joins many other minerals and salts and needs process of breaking up material relations and installing new relations to become a profitable product. Echoing these processes, I started tracing the elements that were put in place, that were inserted so that lithium and its extraction were possible. Probably the first issue was the development of narrative, as I've shown in the beginning, reproduced by media, politics, experts, that they insisted that lithium was the new copper and that we needed to learn from past mistakes and to build a sustainable industry around it. In contrast, a former Licanantay indigenous people that live in Salar de Atacama told me that we should not lose sight of lithium, what lithium market is compared to copper. There are orders of magnitude of difference, so we shouldn't get lost in that, because Chile is not going to stop being a producer of copper. Atacama or Chile, they are not going to become any Saudi Arabia. The economic data support his vision. The oil industry was 500 times bigger than lithium carbonate. Indeed, the volume of copper industry in worldwide was around 80 times bigger in tons and 40 times bigger in US dollars than lithium carbonate by 2019. And in 10 years of boom, lithium had never reached even 1% of contribution to the Chilean GDP. Chile is the second largest lithium producer worldwide. Equally, economists and engineers told me that we needed to hurry up and take this brief opportunity because there were already many initiatives to replace lithium-ion batteries. And unlike copper, there were already very few private economic interests in place that were taking all the opportunities. During the entire 2010 decade, several scandals of corruption pointed out towards the Chilean lithium company SQM Salar and its former main shareholder and president, Julio González, a key figure during the military dictatorship and an ex-son-in-law of the dictator, Augusto Pinochet. With dubious actions during the 90s, in 2014, the national scenario saw consecutive corruption scandals starring SQM, illegal financing of diverse politicians, stock market manipulation, illegally inscribed states' water rights and mining easements under SQM property, misinforming the state about the quantity of what was being extracted. As such, economic interest, corruption, and development narratives highlighted the resource abundance that constitutes commodity supply zones and obscures everything but lithium. Indeed, the idea of an empty Salar de Atacama was present Molina and Mendez, Prieto and Godoy have shown how the Salar de Atacama was deliberately built into an unpopulated and hostile landscape, and how it was built as an uneven landscape, first by the saltpeter fever and then by the development of copper industry. Indeed, the abundance of extractive infrastructures, highways, trunks, Antofagasta ports, industrial plants, as Marina was showing, was the result of putting in place the materialities needed to extract other materialities. Nevertheless, this was not only it was not the only landscape. Instead, a few Licanantay people expressed their frustration with this outsider view of the desert as an inhospitable territory, because for them it was rather abundant and wonderful place to live, as the ancestors did. Indeed, so a view of what needs to be in place and be abundant. Indeed, while deepening my fieldwork, I was taught another way of seeing and inhabiting what I will call the desertscape, an abundant and beautiful whole and interconnected territory within Patahoiri, which is the Kunsa word for Mother Earth, a relational inherited landscape where the past was materialized in the territory and where everything had meaning and not mining. The desertscape was also key for Patahoiri, as it allowed her to channel all the heat. As such, deserts had a key role on Earth, and without it, Mother Earth would be unbalanced. And eventually, unlike lithium, the desertscape was an extensive, visible ethnographic object. It was everywhere. As I was told, even talking about water as something separate from the entire territory was an assumption. Land, water, earth beings, and mountains all were deeply connected, and it was in their relations between all with humans and non-humans that the territory was produced and reproduced. For many, this fragmentation was bringing so many problems. The desertscape was understood to be ruined and fragmented in a colonization empowered by Chilean state and private companies, an active process of breaking the relations with Patahoiri as well as breaking the landscape. As such, water scarcity and a damaged environment were also in place as a result of these ways of relating. Therefore, producing territories as mining scapes meant not only expanding a commodification of the desertscape, but also expanding the one world to allow extractivism. It was not only about the environment, but about ways of being in the world that were at stake, as shown by political ontology. Indeed, the extractive production of territory was part of both a narrative and as a way to relate. The ontology behind a mining scape was also installing ways of being in the world, ways of seeing, and of course, ways of not seeing. The lack of reciprocity and complementarity, the individual separated from the community, and the land separating from the community were all parts of rebuilding a one-world world. And therefore, they construct a world where lithium does exist, and where land, people, and water are fragmented resources that can be taken away, classified, and recombined as needed, deepening power inequalities and racial capitalism. And when separating parts from the whole, from wholes is possible, we have fragments. And fragments do not have territorial roots. They don't have external relations, and they don't belong anymore. As a consequence, the creation of mining scapes was allowed as ideas of lithium, triangle and lithium, and types of water, and the unpopulated Atacama Desert were key to put in place and in the place in order to extract. So what does it tell us about green technologies and hegemonic conceptions of energy transition? They are still framed within a racial capitalist one world that has produced and reproduced mining scapes with technological-based oriented solutions that would only continue to fragment and to ruin the surviving remains of the world. In this regard, looking not only at what is extracted, but insertion and extraction dynamics can offer a much more insightful and complex landscape to think again all the energy that we are consuming to achieve a techno-managerial energy transition and all the colonial features that are deepened in the process. It allows us to better understand the ruins that we have created and that the green technologies are deepening. But it also reveals the need for any action aiming tackling our social and environmental crisis to take into account that we and what we and Mother Earth have already put in place and its consequences. So only then our decolonial climate hopes may find possibilities within current visions of impossibilities.
Thank you very much, Daniela. We much more than ions in Atacama. And we will collect clarification questions if there are any, like very briefly. Otherwise, we move to the next presentation by Karlis Laksevich, if that's, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation.
It's all right.
Laksevich.
Or I would say Lakshevitz, but yeah, it works.
Okay. Well, welcome, Karlis. Karlis Laksevich is a researcher at the University of Latvia and a PhD student at Wageningen University and Research. His current research focuses on the green, digitalizing and social transformations in the Baltic region, especially in relation to how housing inequality interacts with climate policies that aim to transform the whole. Okay, so we are awake. We are awake. So Karlis' research especially focused on the relation to how housing inequality interacts with climate policies that aim to transform the whole metabolism of the housing stock. So welcome, Karlis. Thanks for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction and yeah, for the whole panel, which sums up really nicely. First of all, can you see my screen and hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good, very good. So hello everyone, I can also now see you. So yeah, so let me start then. So in my presentation, I'll move on a bit from the sites of extraction to the sites of consumption and to households, especially in households rather in the global north, in the rather, let's say, semi-periphery and the sort of the margins of the global north in Latvia, where I do my research. And this research happens mostly in the context of a project that explores the transformations that would be needed to for European countries actually to implement the Paris Agreement in terms of lifestyle change, but of course looking at lifestyle in terms of how structural factors affect it and in which ways actually people in their everyday decisions can make or cannot make due to infrastructure arrangements and other things, changes in their lifestyle in regards to complying to what we call 1.5 degree lifestyles or lifestyles that comply with such carbon consumption that do not heat the climate more than 1.5 degrees. So it's quite a challenge since in Europe the overshoot is quite large. So what we've been doing field work also with people who have made such lifestyle changes and trying to see how their carbon footprint and how their ways of actually making these changes in their life are met with a variety of challenges and are met with their own sort of ideological underpinnings and as well as a different kind of income-based and imagination-based forms of hoping to actually change their lifestyle and move on towards less consumptive lifestyles. What I will move on towards is something that a quotation from an interview I've had with a person who's made a few changes in his life. He's running an organic farm. He's set up solar panels, but rather due to the case that it was too expensive for him to connect to the national grid. So it's a kind of a mixed choice, but it kind of shows that everyday choices of energy transition that people are facing, and that I want to explore through exploring the issues of how income and certain other dispositions that relate rather to class come together. And what I find interesting in many of these accounts of lifestyle change, for example, is that they are based and how they relate to technologies, that they're based on certain kind of relations of work that relate to technology. And what I like, for example, in this narrative was that my interlocutor was actually saying that he was first of all reflecting on the income inequalities, and showing that, as I quote, that if you're not very rich, then you have to understand that you'll have to learn and solve the arising technical problems yourself, which is meaning maintenance of solar panels and other things that he's made in his household. But that also, shows that it's a lot of these issues are about tinkering with technologies, about imagining them being affordable, and in general sense of a sense of how climate relates to technology. And here I will, in this presentation, draw on a few theoretical strands of interpretation. First of all, of thinking of drawing on Hannah Knox's work on her conception of climate as a technical infrastructural concept, which rather has certain epistemological roots, and which in this case, as I see how people who have made these lifestyle changes think about climate-related lifestyle choices, is seen as from this technical point of view of how certain things that people do in their lives contribute or do not towards changing climate. So this sense that if we talk of green technologies, then it's also important to note that there is some kind of technological way of thinking when people think about climate. The second thing why I draw in one presentation I talk about class, even though my interlocutors rather talk about income inequalities in a way that represents the previous quotation I showed of thinking rich, poor, and elite, and so on, is that I draw from Jerry Morris, who in his exploration of working class in post-Soviet Russia, and which has a lot of similarities to post-Soviet Latvia, draws on ideas of that, for a lot of people who are working class, there's a lot of tinkering with technologies, tinkering with kind of labor that allows to live habitable lives. So in this sense, what I'm pointing towards is that there in this kind of energy transition from household level, it also, and drawing from the previous quotation, it relates to ways of how people not only imagine which technologies you can buy, but also how you can work with them in your everyday life and how much that costs to you, either time-wise or skill-wise. And I also draw from Paris Marx, who's in recent exploration on what the Silicon Valley gets wrong about the transition in the automobile industry, is that there is a specific kind of idea of what tech is in the Silicon Valley. And this kind of idea of tech I also found in my field work with people who have done these changes, but in a way that that technology is seen as solar panels, as heat pumps, as electric vehicles as this part that relates a bit less to the everyday skills of working with technology that people actually have. So this interesting relation between understanding elite tech and people's non-affordable imagination towards that that form the kind of technological and kind of green hope that can form in people's minds. So yeah, and I will not go in the fourth theoretical route, but I will go straight back to the portraits and examples of the lifestyle changes that me and my colleagues observed in our research. So the question I'm asking is, how are these class and income-related dispositions towards technology regulating the kind of imaginations and hopes of reducing household emissions? So let's consider a few people that we met. These are pseudonymized accounts where some details have been changed in order to also mix some people together. So let's consider Dinas. His household income is over 2,000 euros. He's recently renovated his house. He's installed also a heat pump, which allows to decarbonize the heating, and heating is the largest source of emissions in Latvia, which is quite a cold country. And then he actually, with many of these choices and with his an income over 2,000 euros in Latvia is very high. So this is the sort of, I would call the higher level. So what he sees the energy transition as is as a Europeanizing modernization of technology, of ways of actually technological advancement that these greener solutions bring. They are technological forms of technological advancement. However, in this process, he also sees that there are many comfort dilemmas that he has to make in order to reduce larger consumption, for example, international flights and things like that, but which his lifestyle and his work does not allow him to do. So he still has to make many choices, but he sees this technology as sort of innovation, modernization. Second, let's consider Raivis. Income is from household income from 1,000 to 2,000 euros. He is downshifted in his career because he decided not to fly at all, and then this made adjustments to the kind of projects that he can contribute to, as this was before the pandemic, when more hybrid forms are available. And he's running a community where they are trying to find ways how to more easily afford technologies and technologies just like as well as mobility technologies and repairs and things like that allow them to reduce their emissions. And for him, like this transition in their household was more an aesthetic downshifting. And he was talking also of aesthetic, because he had a Christian context, so he was using this aestheticism idea, but he's also talking of a certain type of degrowth because he had downshifted. So there was a lot of engagement between creating sort of relationships within a community and creating these relationships within ways of working with technology. Now let's consider the third example that I want to show is Maira. She's living in the more easternmost region of Latvia, and her household income is less than 1,000 euros taxes. She's working as a youth worker, disadvantaged children, and also teaches them recycling and upcycling and things like that. And how she sees the kind of transition that they've made in their household is more as learning more ecological crafts. So for her, it was more kind of ecologically aware physical labor that was forming their ability to reduce pollution, reduce their emissions, even though they had a car. So this was taking more of their emission level, but their heating was more based on wood stove, and so a bit more local with certain type of emissions, but without that much of fossils. So within these three examples, and these are just some of the interviews we've done, what we've been thinking of is that there are certain ways of how we can note that within categories, income levels, or certain class dispositions towards physical labor, there are certain commonalities. I do not propose the kind of table that I have in my presentation as something that is like that, because there's a lot of intermeshing between that, but there was something that we could notice, that there is a difference in the technological imagination that was forming from one side to another within the people who had made these choices. Within, if we would look at the other direction, or to more people in deeper levels of poverty, I assume the situation would be different, and this is something I'm facing in another research project. But within this research, what we would note—
You have 2 minutes.
Yes, is that there's a type of, for the highest income, you can imagine of building near zero emission, buying new, you can imagine buying and replacing tech, you can imagine innovation, and you rather think of self-limitation. In the middle level, it's you do a lot of thinking about how to do things together. You're calculating a lot of cost savings to think about education and sort of thinking about independence within the household in a certain way. And within this, more towards in lower income levels, there is more thinking of repair, saving energy, and this kind of more ideological thinking of self-sufficiency, which is something that Morris also noted within his working class households in Russia. So what I want to point out was what I think this points towards in this in imagining affordances of green technologies, that it is a lot dependent on class and income, as and we know that the highest levels of emissions uncomparably are towards those who, even if they are ecologically aware, those towards the highest consumption levels and the highest incomes. There is sort of this difference in what tech is imagined to be and what tech can be without a lot of expenses. So this probably is an element of thinking about imagination towards degrowth and moving towards more reuse and so on. So it's a change in thinking about technology as well, and skill. And on the other side, we do note that in this research, the biggest technology rather forms on the business level kind of marginal, even though I emphasize it here, it was rather more marginal. It was more of thinking of climate technically for people who make lifestyle changes, and of drawing on resources of ideologies of different types of consumption, like minimalism, asceticism, degrowth, and things that allowed for people to imagine a different kind of ways of living, something that relates also to the last part of the previous presentation. So I want to leave kind of as my last note, and since I don't have much time, but that there is a large space for anthropological imagination here of offering these perceptions of ways of living that is actually crucial in order to think of 1.5 degree lifestyles that actually afford and have large impact on lowering emissions in ways that do not necessarily strive towards extractivist supporting ways of trying to achieve green technologies that will allow the kind of consumption that was there before. So yeah, I think that is it from my side, leaving an open space for ecological imagination. And yeah, so if you have some more questions, then you can write in the email.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you very much. we need to move immediately to our last presentation. So I will introduce our next speaker, Selina Gallo-Cruz. Selina, are you there? Can you listen? Are you there? Yes, you are. So Selina Gallo-Cruz.
Yes.
Gallo-Cruz. Selina Gallo-Cruz is Associate Professor of Sociology at Syracuse University. She earned her PhD from Emory University and her Bachelor from Wellesley College. And she's a political and cultural sociologist with expertise in social movements, strategic action studies, gender, and global theory. Her current research focuses on the interaction between protest and political fields in environmental policy, and she has authored Political Invisibility and Mobilization, Women Against State Violence in Argentina, Yugoslavia, and Liberia, awarded an American Sociological Association Outstanding Book Award in Peace and Conflict Studies, as well as dozens of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. So welcome, Selina. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And if you could interrupt me when my time is running out, I can't see the chats. So with that, I'll begin. The first time I learned about the possibility of human extinction as an outcome of the industrial era was in an earth science class in 2002, shortly after the term Anthropocene had been coined, but before it was popularized to denote a new age in which the earth's composition had been uniquely altered by humans. My professor, a former geologist in oil extraction, then world expert on coral reefs, was discussing star life cycles on this particular day. The discussion turned to the life cycle we could expect of our own star, the sun, a yellow dwarf, that would one day die the same way other stars die, burning brighter, burning everything up in its vicinity until it burns out completely, some stars exploding or collapsing. So this means the Earth will burn out with it, we asked our professor. That is correct, he affirmed. The air felt heavy with the weight of contemplating the end of life on Earth, but we lingered there stupefied only for a moment before Professor cracked the silence with another shocking disclosure of scientific study. I don't know why y'all are worrying about the end of our sun, he added in his Midwestern drawl. It's looking unlikely that humans will survive the chemical age. Then he began to explain to us what was known by both scientists and the oil industry at the time, the industry he formerly worked for, about the limits to growth, the coming changes in global warming, and the pollution of our biosphere by our global consumerist society, all of which also threaten life on Earth. Much has happened in the development of climate knowledge and policy in the decades to follow, but the shock triggered by talk of human limits endures. Today, I'll share research excerpted from a book manuscript in progress in which I explore the ontological distinctions underlying different responses to ecological crises. In this particular chapter, from which I'm developing an article, I explore how and why discussions of the limits to growth violate paradigmatic boundaries in the urgent debates over best policy responses to climate emergency, and my opening vignette illustrating the paradox, which is why some scientific discussions of extinction invoke a particular moral response and others do not. So quickly, I'll say this involved ethnographic content analysis of written and spoken narratives, ongoing. I'm up to 50 interviews and over 100 observations. The interviews collected with climate and earth systems scientists and biologists, geologists, engineers, financial analysts, architects, policymakers, journalists, and scholars, all of whom have had decades of leadership experience in their field with global recognition. The findings that have emerged, which I will discuss below, can be summarized as follows. First, a sharp division exists between acceptable and unacceptable considerations in the interface between climate science and policy. Second, this division demarcates definitive boundaries around a paradigmatic response to the crisis of global warming. Third, the division is governed by sanctions of repudiation, shaming, and dismissal. Fourth, there is a backstage from public policy arenas in which sanctions are relaxed and so-called forbidden data is openly and readily acknowledged and discussed. And fifth, acceptable and unacceptable evidence are distinguished by the same cultural logics governing the death taboo. So I'll be drawing on the framework of Mary Douglas set out in her book, Priority and Danger, as well as the many works that have helped to extend this theory into contemporary studies. In the interest of time, I'll say briefly here that several tenets of this work are important to explaining my own findings. The first is the demarcation of the sacred and the profane through the identification of sanctions that help to protect and govern normative science with the potential to inform policy. The second is the presence of scapegoating as another social structure governing taboos and their prescribed sanctions. All of my respondents share observations of or personal experiences of sanctions associated with the discussion of particular kinds of scientific content. So now I'll share a selection of my findings, which in the paper will be organized into two main sections on forbidden facts and normative staging. So on the other side of the boundary guarding the sacred from the profane of climate knowledge lies what I refer to as forbidden facts, identified as such because the mention of them invokes repudiation. Mark began his career as a biologist for one of the largest Native American reservations in the US. During his tenure as director, however, he quickly learned that the same land where game thrived and used as vital income for the tribes was also sought after by large energy extraction companies, with these projects fragmented wildlife habitats. His interest in the relationship between economic growth and conservation losses led him to earn a PhD on the topic from a top-ranking university, and this original data set and research earned him the position of the first ever director of conservation at the US Fish and Wildlife Service, newly created in 1997 with the expansion of US conservation law and the Wildlife Protection Act. But when he began to suggest opening a critical discussion of pro-expansion policies leading to ecological decline in areas that should otherwise be protected for conservation, he received both a verbal and written gag order against speaking about the relationship between economic growth and conservation in any capacity as the department director. This happened again and again as he tried different strategies and for years until he eventually left the office to develop an international NGO where he can openly advocate for sustainable economic or steady state and pro-conservation policy. Peter had long worked for the mining and coal industry as a specialist in blasting. As the sustainability industry gained momentum, he was asked by his managers to come up with a presentation on how the industry could continue its work sustainably, in response to which he felt perplexed. No one on the inside that he knew had ever been of the impression that it could be ecologically sustainable. He felt compelled instead to begin to give honest presentations of all that the mining in his particular company and in the industry widely involves. The processing of gold in an average mine, to name one example, consumes more than 1 million liters of water a day, and the separation of gold from ore pollutes the surrounding freshwater with cyanide, a toxin that can be lethal in even small quantities. Added to the harms of processing was the effects of the tailing dams, which also contains residues of explosives, fuel, and other toxins used in the mining process. Peter would use this image shown here in his presentations to hit home the point that mining always has consequences, none of them which are or can be made environmentally friendly or sustainable. His attitude and approach led to constant sanctions in the workplace and in the industry, and he explained coming to understand that two topics were understood by him as prohibited in front of certain audiences, to suggest that the mining industry would not or could not infinitely grow, and that it was not and could not be environmentally sustainable would lead to silencing and ostracization among peers. Now, there have been strong sanctions imposed on those who discuss the limits to growth in particular sectors, does not stop them from speaking out or from making bold proclamations of the need for radical transformations in policy, although they often have to try and find new spaces in which they can do so and maintain their work. One of the conservation biologists I spoke with was a lead author on the viral World Scientist Warning of a Climate Emergency paper in 2020, recently followed by a 2021 paper, which begins with a strong and clear declaration and warning. The science is clear and irrefutable. Humanity is in advanced ecological overshoot. Our overexploitation of resources exceeds ecosystems' capacity to provide them or to absorb our waste. society has failed to meet clearly stated goals of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and so forth. That stated, Rachel has responded to the call of fellow scholars to build up an international organization aimed at curbing population growth, and in the process has found significant barriers to even broaching this now taboo topic from a feminist framework, the most common being the accusation that any focus on population growth in the developing world is patrimonial at best and a form of eugenics at worst. Many have explored the nuances and validity of these claims, but the nuances of the discourse and the policy proposals seem to matter less than the symbolic life the concept overpopulation has taken on. All of my respondents noted population growth was definitely a forbidden topic and one you had to be very careful in how you addressed. Examples include the accusation that David Attenborough's claim that humans have overrun the world, exploring the vestiges of biodiversity currently under threat, may be conveying the wrong message, and his patronage of the organization Population Matters may present a risky flirtation with quote unquote eco-fascism. Wendy is a hydrogen engineer who developed hydrogen patents and consulted the US military before moving overseas to take a professorial job and research position in Southeast Asia. Her career shift toward a focus on sustainable engineering came much later when her son asked her if any of the systems designs she worked on and taught about were truly sustainable or could address climate change. She had to answer honestly no. She decided to turn her efforts toward devising what a truly sustainable engineering program might actually look like. She writes, this involves changing the unsustainable system rather than adding so-called sustainable technologies to the system, eliminating an energy load rather than using more renewable energy, eliminating plastic in the product stream rather than making more plastic recyclable, and so on. Her work has been recognized and funded by programs in France, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, but she fights an uphill battle against the paradigmatic orientation towards technological fixes and growth. Recently, a new program she initiated on the Shetland Islands upon the generous support of a private funder has been cut by 50% and is now organized as an add-on to other business ventures, like those she has found particularly problematic in delaying meaningful real change. So a second major finding in my research is the phenomenal relaxing of the sanctioning of taboo topics in backstage arenas. These include private and semi-private discussions among experts and insiders where the public or other stakeholders and certain antagonists are out of view. Martha was an actuary that came into the insurance industry shortly before the OPEC oil crisis of the 1970s. Working for several powerful firms over the years, she became expert in global energy trends that affected market fluctuations, producing reports on how oil supplies triggered price changes and inflation that would affect insurance premiums and payouts in decades to come. She explained that although the knowledge of energy limits in both diminishing quality and quantity of oil supplies was data at once essential to doing any sort of actuary work producing economic projections, she was also keenly aware that an understanding of it eluded mainstream consciousness. So she eventually made the switch to doing full-time research on these issues around 2006.
You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. She describes the takeoff of this next phase of her career as fast-moving. She was invited to meet with global policymakers and provide lectures on her research on blind spots in energy modeling and feedback loop effects of low oil prices, the unacknowledged problems of intermittent modeling, poor taxation plans for energy markets, and the fallacies of energy projections for new alternative energy technologies, teaching graduate courses at the Petroleum University in China, invited to speak to academic, actuarial, government, industry, policy, think tanks, and military and State Department researchers all over the world on peak oil and so forth, being flown to private elite advisory meetings and on, speaking to the heads of European Commission, UN Task Force, etc. She spoke to me at length about her observations moving in and out of different social circles where these issues are discussed rather openly among insiders, and yet where professors develop an approach to taming their messages to students to make them feel that although the situation is dire, there might be some solutions they can work on, although they personally don't believe this to be true. She also spoke to me about the different messages shared internally among the OECD and military planners versus what gets publicized. Jimmy was a technology scholar and engineer who undertook a years-long research project with officials at the Department of Energy, industry insiders, wind farms, biofuel energy, and so forth, all of whom admitted that they understand their technology is not green at all. They know about the human rights effects others on the panel have discussed, even though they know that it's in their best interest to market it as such. When he published his book and went on a publicizing tour, he began to receive paradoxical reactions from the left and from elites. Environmentalists attacking him for debunking the proposals in green energy they have built their movement on, and a constant stream of invitations, he told me at least once a week at one point, from hedge fund investors who wanted him to advise their firms on how far their investment portfolios might take them before and ideally through an energy crash. And here you have the latest JP Morgan annual report making fun of the green energy movement very boldly. So this is just a brief sample. I've interviewed, as I said, 50 experts this far. So I'll just summarize the ending to my paper in progress, which is that theoretically, I compare the quality and structure of taboos and the governance of taboos, including the death taboo, but also the incest taboo, and how they relate to the potential for movement transformation of the policy discourse, and the potential to begin to discuss some of these things that are openly acknowledged in private in a public sphere. And then I also share some of the data that my respondents have shared with me. They're not just critics of the fallacies of these proposals and the shortcomings of the green growth approach, but they've actually spent years working on research on viable economic degrowth and redistribution plans that could help to support some of the problems that scholars at the IPCC warn will affect the most marginalized, as there are more interruptions due to climate change and ecological decline. And I will stop there.
Thank you. And I would immediately give the floor to Horacio Ortiz without further ado. But I will present you before. Yes, Horacio Ortiz received his PhD from the EPOL, the Haute Institute, the Altos Estudios and Social Science, and he's currently a researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research and an associate professor of at the East China Normal University in Shanghai, and he's connected from Shanghai at the moment. His research is concerned with money and finance from a perspective of political anthropology, and he did fieldwork in the financial industry in New York, Paris, and Shanghai. So thanks for being with us, Horacio, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you everybody for the presentations and the discussions also in the previous panel, and thank you for the organizers for having invited me here. So first, a huge caveat, which is that as you heard from the presentation, and if you look at my work, I shouldn't be here because it's not my specialty, energy or green energy, but I've been working on the finance industry from a global perspective and from a perspective of political anthropology, and so I'll try to say some things, things based on that experience and the conversations we've been having so far. I think that, and also drawing on some of the things that Simone Abram highlighted in the previous session. So I want to first highlight a certain variety of imaginaries that have been foregrounded in the presentations. And this is in connection with the idea that the panel is also about imagination. And then I want to ask a few questions about the potentials and the limitations that we may have in different forms of imagination. So Simone talked about life and death as a crucial component of all these conversations, and I think they carried on here. And so just to go in line with these huge philosophical questions, I think that we can also ask how these presentations propose different imaginaries about time. What is time? What are the temporal dimensions of what we experience, the past, the present, the future, how they relate? Space, what are the spaces where things are happening? Is it global, local, national, and so on? And connected to that, ideas of change in terms of transition, collapse, development, crisis, and other forms. And so I want to ask a few questions, and sorry, I cannot address all the papers, of course, one by one. There's no time, and so I'll be unfair to all of them, hopefully on equal terms. But I think that some of the papers talk about time scales that are very different. For instance, in some of the papers, we have notions of immediacy of transformation, for instance, in lifestyles that can be changed just by doing something different around your house. And in other papers, we talk about potential radical transformations, but that would happen in some kind of epochal change when, say, different forms of scientific knowledge for the last paper would be adopted. And in other papers, we have almost notions of the eternal that seem to be in place. The first paper talks about thinking about a world that is permanently polluted. And I want to highlight this notion of permanent because there is a certain notion of temporality in the papers that we discussed and in the talks about climate change and its fixes that presuppose some kind of ex ante where this was not happening. And now we face the change. And so what is the future? And this is something Simone highlighted. I want to read that you know, what are the parts of the past that become iconic in order to think the future, right? And whether we can think the future as something that can be changed or whether we're suddenly settled in some kind of permanence of destruction or despair. You know, and this kind of echoes this idea that change is a biblical call, which is something that appears in the first presentation in the paper, more in the presentation. And I think that the kinds of ontologies of the Mother Earth in the second paper also seem to call to some kind of permanence that would need to be addressed. And so you see, we have very different temporal scales. And I think in terms of space, we also have very different, and they're not just temporal scales in terms of time spans, millions of years, hundreds of seconds, but also different ways of thinking how time unfolds or what is the past, how it connects to what is the present and to what is the future. So there's a lot of food for thought there. And in terms of space as well, some of the papers focus on particular sites from the house in Latvia to a plant that is treating waste to a kind of region, but also the region, sorry, like for instance in northern Chile. The fourth paper in a way has no site, and I was very puzzled by that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But also these papers sometimes mobilize ideas of the global that already articulate notions of space, such as the division between global north and global south. And these forms of thinking, the globe or the relation to space in everyday practice, I think they point to different ways of understanding what are the problems and how they can be solved. And so I'll go back to that in a minute. So I think I just want to highlight that variety to then bring a little bit of this kind of thinking about anthropological imagination, which is that I think that the way in anthropology, the way we ask the questions, the way we define the problems to be addressed critically is also a way that allows for seeing new worlds, for seeing new possibilities, but is also for closing those things for which we don't ask questions, those things that we don't set up as problems, right? And so I think that these tensions appear very much in a topic like climate change or green energy that seems to be framed in a way that touches everything, because it's the whole planet with everything that is happening in it, right? And I think so then when we start cutting these issues into certain problems, we are always facing this tension that there are these other problems that are not there. And I think that Carly's paper put that up front, saying, well, even if we look at a kind of, a small region, we see that the way that problems are framed and analyzed are already distinguished in terms of income. So what is the problem, right? We have a very big variety of problems. And so one of the things that I draw from political anthropology then is to think when we are addressing a problem like this one, climate change or supposedly green energy transition and fixes, is what are the power relations in which that are present in the sites where we observe? Who is speaking for which audience? Who is acting in which kinds of relations? And I think that at least that allows us to limit some of our claims, but also it allows us to probably raise these power relations as a more general problem. And so I think that, for instance, talking about differences in income in the ways that environmental questions are framed is an important insight for all our researchers on these topics, because the different claims that we face are marked by these different positionalities. And if we don't bring these positionalities up front, we may be expanding some claims or not universalizing them, but giving them a kind of taking them out of sight in a way that makes them a bit hard to understand. So I would say that, for instance, for the last paper, I was puzzled by the fact that the respondents are all quite elite. They all work in within the industries that are profiting from environmental destruction, if you can say, and then they move out and actually do find audiences and do find legitimacy for their words, right? And so, but at the same time, they still operate in particular circuits, social relations and so on. And so I was wondering if we could hear more about where they participate and where are other voices that don't participate and that don't even get that kind of audience. And I think that for the third paper, you talk about the margins of the global north. And I was wondering if this is just a way to situate the place with a metaphor, or if you are also thinking about some kind of global imagination of the global that distinguishes the north and the south or the whatever. And I'm sensitive to this because I work in China, which usually doesn't fit any of it in a very problematic way, because as we know, it's a place where a lot of pollution goes on. So I need to stop. But for the first paper, just talking about this positionality, the company you study seems to have a lot of money to buy machines that they don't even use. And so I was wondering if you could tell us more about that part of the story. And for the second paper, you bring some kind of discourse about Mother Earth, roots, belonging, kind of rejection of fragmentation. And I was wondering, who speaks for that? Where, who is legitimate and where to have that kind of discourse, right? And why would that matter for the audience of your papers? Just as a way to launch the conversation. Thank you again. I learned a lot, and I finish here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Horacio. We invite the speakers. Oh, okay. Yeah. So Horacio's questions are there in the air. If any of you wants to say something, I will try to be short. Academic conference, I'm not putting deep, actually. No, we need more time, but this is just a glimpse. It gives us a glimpse of possible questions, and I would also like to give some moment to Simone afterwards to, if you want to respond to Horacio or to add or to resonate with something Horacio said. So please.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Thank you so much, Horacio. And I feel like it would have been great to also have a debate with the kind of first part of the panel. But just really quickly, the investment that this company gets from, so half of it is from the ports, so directly linked to the port authority, because they deal with all of the maritime waste, and that's kind of very fixed income. So they get the environmental tax from any ship docking in Ghana. That's the main source of income, but they work very closely with the oil industry, and the other source of revenue is actually acting as a local partner to a subsidiary of an oil company that provides chemicals. And this is something that they have started doing. So as part of, one side is remediating the kind of chemical waste, the other side is essentially just being a pretty passive recipient of chemicals that are then used offshore, for which they don't actually get much capacity to, much kind of agency to get that much from. I mean, they're just the kind of local partner in the corporate arrangement of the setup of the company. But that kind of links to your question about permanence, because, for a lot of the engineers that I worked with, this was one company that offered them a way to actually explore the things they wanted to change and things that they wanted to do in a way that public funding of public, the Environmental Protection Agency couldn't. And so it came to fill in a lot of the gaps in public funding that weren't there. And that brings me to that question of permanence that I think is really important. It's this idea that that we now live in a permanent polluted world, and that might not have been the case before. I think what they're advocating for is not this idea of permanence, but the idea of partiality of change, and seeing where they can make a small difference, a kind of very marginal difference to what they see as a much bigger problem. And I think that, a lot of those discussions of permanence often don't give enough attention to that kind of micro scale of change. But I'll leave it there. Maybe Daniela.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, so I'm taking Ingalls and Bender definition of landscape as time materializing. So that's a constant process of materiality becoming, but also instilling certain properties from the certain materialities. And I think it's very useful to think temporalities. I really like the way Andean cosmologists think about the the time. So you're looking at the past and you don't know the future, and the past it's like circular version of time. So I think that you have past, present, and future all the time, like in the landscape. So it's material and immaterial, if you want. And I think that's kind of the thinking behind insertion, or what it's put it in to extract, and the constraints that it instills in what is extracted. And in terms of the imaginaries about Mother Earth and fragmentation, I think it's a way to express that. So I'm taking mainly the Likanantai cosmovision, the indigenous people that live in the salt flat. I mean, in the region, not only in the watershed where the salt flat is placed. And I think that they know that there is a fragmentation that can be related to age, in the sense that the eldest perceive that the youngest have a different view, and that something is being lost. And you can find these discourses of fragmentation and Mother Earth and the desert scape, as I name it. They don't name it that way. It's not translatable in Spanish. To make sense of the crisis that they feel the landscape and themselves are living, because they also perceive that they are fragmented, and that mining has been fragmented the population, the communities. There's no such thing as a community and we're all think the same, not at all. It's very contested. You have very diverse understandings. You have lots of conflict. But there is this sense that there's another way, and for anthropological imagination, I wanted to highlight the desertscape as a way forward where you can find abundance, and you don't need to install all these machines, and you don't need all this technological scenario to think ways forward.
Great. So Carlos or Selena, you want to react?
I can continue. Yeah, I'll start with a space and then move on to time. Yeah, in regards to the space question about the global north. Well, in regards to Eastern Europe, it's also usually have had troubles with this this categorization. But what I wanted to point out is that Latvia is part of the European Green Deal. It's part of the policies that address the issue from the side of, you know, certain global north narratives as the site of production, in regards of site of a lot of consumption and a site of the technological advancement. And in regards to where Latvia stands in this space, it's kind of weird. It's not. It has relatively high consumption rates, but it's kind of it's not like a technological citadel in that sense. And the major development narratives is to catch up to Western Europe in regards to development. And this also comes up in regards to green technologies, because the kind of where people look at is the Nordic models and a lot of Nordic investment. If we talk about green businesses and green entrepreneurship that comes in, and the ideas also Green Deal is often by Nordic banks are the ones that support ideas of Green Deal, and there's a lot of Nordic construction companies are the ones that are leading projects that certificate the most like green investments. So there's like this kind of this space which aspires in the elite consumption, but this is not really fitted well. So this is what I was pointing towards with these margins of the global north, but that, you know, it's problematic in a sense. I agree with you. Regarding to temporality, this is a very interesting. This would be a different presentation, I think, because we noticed multiple temporalities in this research, and which do not easily as well fit the class category, which do not, which we're still trying to figure out. I guess I will try to recode the material based on your suggestions that also came from Simone, because this question is very interesting. There's certain, like,
At least, could you make it short because of time restraint?
Yes, time restraint. But I'm gonna mention there's a question of immediacy. There's the question of acceleration and speeding down. There was the question of sense of accumulation with time, or people were speaking of like accumulating practices that do not contribute to climate change. Like you sense with time, you're one by one, you're trying to fix your lifestyle. So this is also a very interesting temporal frame that is there. So yeah, I would point out that there's very interesting multiple temporalities that me and my colleagues are still gonna explore. That yeah. So thank you for the suggestion there.
Thanks, Carlos. Selena.
Yes, so I'll try and be brief. Thank you for your comments. I'll try and address them now and also in my paper. In terms of the space and the site, the scene site is the boardroom where these discussions are had over how to translate the expertise into policy. But there's an unseen site because these policies have global reverberations on multiple levels, as you note. And so that would be everywhere extraction, consumption, and waste occurs. And then who speaks for whom and elites in the industry. I could only give a sample of my conversations. Elites in the sense that they're having conversations with elites, but I was interested, and it's a very theoretically selected sample of mostly scientists and also some of the other experts who are, for lack of a better term, whistleblowers, in that they were willing to have very honest conversations about things that you're not supposed to talk about and what happens when you talk about them in certain spaces. So I don't know that they're fit in a traditional elite category. So I'm going to think about that some more as I write it up. But I rely on the research of political ecology to talk about the other end of these extraction chains, and all of my respondents are aware of what happens at these sites and the human rights and ecological violations. And then the last thing I'll say is that part of the reason I've added not just comparison with literature on the death taboo, but also literature on the incest taboo, is that there's been a social movement led by feminists and survivors of incest and sexual assault to change the power dynamics of what is spoken of in private by publicizing it. And then that democratizes those dynamics. And so I like the theme of imaginaries in our panel, because so many of my respondents, being whistleblowers, again, for lack of a better term, would like to have open conversations because they are concerned about the effects of the most vulnerable. So thank you again, everyone, for your research and you for your comments. I appreciate them.
So thank you all. We are running out of time, but I don't know if you, Simone, would like to say something, and then the conveners. Thanks. And I apologize for the rest of the group, but we have a little time. So
yeah, I would actually like to respond. I'd particularly like to respond to Horacio's comments because I think his reflections are really useful here, and I have been trying to persuade him in the past to do some research on the energy finance, and maybe we've piqued his interest enough to get him involved. I mean, there are some people now doing a little bit more work on finances around these kind of cases that we discussed today. And I think it's really essential, actually, that we take that very seriously and try to look into it more effectively, because we're all talking about the way that that drives the things that we see playing out in particular sites. But it kind of tends to remain a little bit occult, like where all this money comes from. It feels like a magic on the ground. So if you don't understand the system behind it, it will always feel kind of unpredictable and unmanageable and unforeseeable. So I've definitely encouraged a bit more work in that area. I think it will help us all.
great, we have a new research agenda there. So not so new. The conveners, I don't know, maybe would like to react or we
just maybe to echo that point, a little history on the panel. First, the idea was Pablo's idea, you have to be credit for that, was to work on finance aspect of it wasn't about green technologies, it was about the lithium industry. And then, well, we wrote the panel, etc. And in the end, including finance, but we didn't get any papers on finance, right? So it's really, there's a need just to echo that, to do that.
And just to thank everybody that came to our panel, and it's a little food for thought, and it's going to be very stimulating the coming weeks. So I think it's lunch now, so the conversation can keep going. And
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
I'd like to think about the